The hum of engines filled the crisp morning air as Charlotte Reynolds adjusted the strap of her leather travel bag, weaving her way through the crowded Atlantic City International Airport. Her deep brown skin glowed faintly beneath the fluorescent lights, and her neatly tied-back hair framed a face of quiet determination. Dressed simply in dark jeans and a white button-up, Charlotte exuded calm confidence, an air that hinted at a lifetime of discipline and precision. Today was her first commercial flight since retiring, and the simple thought of visiting her younger sister and niece brought a rare smile to her face. After decades of flying combat and transport missions for the Air Force, she finally had the luxury of traveling for leisure. The anticipation of seeing little Emma's wide grin made the weight of her duffel bag feel lighter. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, Charlotte noticed the brief flicker in the agent's eyes, a subtle glance, cataloging her outfit, her bag, and finally her face. Charlotte had encountered it before, the unspoken question lingering behind polite professionalism. "Good morning," Charlotte said evenly, offering her ticket and ID. The agent hesitated for half a second before returning a rehearsed smile. "Good morning. May I see your ID?" Charlotte handed over her documents without comment, watching as the agent's eyes lingered on the first-class ticket longer than necessary. The barely perceptible flicker of doubt passed across her face, though she quickly masked it. "Thank you, Miss Reynolds. You're all set. Enjoy your flight," the agent said, her tone softening slightly, as if suddenly aware that Charlotte had caught the hesitation. Charlotte nodded, reclaiming her documents. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. As she moved toward security, Charlotte's expression remained composed, though a familiar tightness crept into her chest. It didn't matter. It never had. Years of service had taught her that people's assumptions rarely held weight against reality. The line through security was uneventful. Around her, the terminal buzzed with conversations. A family excitedly planning their vacation, a young couple deciding whether to upgrade their seats. Behind Charlotte, two businessmen whispered, their eyes flickering toward the first-class pass peeking from her hand. "First class? Wouldn't have pegged her for it," one murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Charlotte let the words drift past her like wind through an open cockpit. Years ago, she might have reacted, but experience had shaped her patience. Some battles weren't worth the energy. Once cleared, Charlotte made her way to the first-class lounge. The atmosphere inside was a stark contrast to the bustling terminal. A soft, warm welcome greeted her at the entrance, the receptionist offering a polite smile as Charlotte entered. She chose a quiet corner, lowering herself into a plush chair. Unpacking a novel from her bag, she settled in, savoring the rare tranquility. The boarding call came sooner than expected, nudging her out of her quiet reflection. Charlotte gathered her belongings and approached the gate, where the crew stood in their crisp uniforms, greeting passengers with pleasant but detached professionalism. Among them stood the captain, a tall, middle-aged man with silver threading through his dark hair. His uniform was immaculate, and his posture rigid with authority. As Charlotte handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, the captain's eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary. Stepping into the first-class cabin, Charlotte could feel the weight of his gaze follow her. Calmly, she chose a window seat and tucked her bag beneath the seat ahead, her movements slow and deliberate. The subtle shift in atmosphere as the captain approached didn't escape her notice. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but edged with something more. "Are you certain this is your seat?" Charlotte met his gaze without flinching, her eyes steady. "Yes, Captain, I'm sure this is my seat." The captain's eyes dropped to the boarding pass resting neatly on her tray table, untouched. His lips pressed into a thin line. "I just want to make sure everything is in order. Sometimes passengers get confused about seat assignments." His tone was polite, but the message was unmistakable. Charlotte let the silence between them stretch, her calm stare unwavering. "There's no confusion," she replied, her voice even. For a moment, the captain seemed taken aback by the quiet firmness in her response. Then, with a tight, reluctant smile, he nodded. "Of course. Well, I hope you enjoy the flight. Let us know if you need anything." Charlotte offered a neutral nod, watching as he turned and strode back toward the front of the plane. She settled into her seat, adjusting her bag once more. Though outwardly calm, the tension in her chest lingered. This wasn't new, but somehow it never stung less. And something told her this wouldn't be the last she heard from Captain Morgan. The engines roared to life as the plane began taxiing to the runway. Charlotte closed her eyes, letting the hum of the aircraft wash over her. Flying had always felt natural, like breathing. This time, though, the familiar rhythm felt heavier. As the plane climbed and leveled off, Charlotte opened her eyes to the view outside the window. Morning light painted the clouds in soft hues of gold and pale blue, stretching endlessly beneath them. This was home. A flight attendant's soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" Charlotte looked up and smiled faintly. "Just water, please." The attendant nodded but seemed distracted, her gaze flickering between Charlotte and the seat beside her. When the glass was handed over, the attendant's smile barely lingered. Charlotte noticed the difference in how warmly she greeted the man across the aisle, who wore a sleek navy suit. Charlotte said nothing, sipping the water slowly. She had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words. A few minutes later, the intercom crackled. "Good morning, this is your captain speaking." The smooth, confident voice filled the cabin. "We've reached cruising altitude at 35,000 feet. For our first-class passengers, I'd like to remind you that we strive to provide the highest level of comfort and service. Please don't hesitate to let the crew know if there's anything we can do to enhance your experience." Charlotte raised a brow at his words. The phrasing, though subtle, felt less like an invitation and more like a reminder to stay in line. She shook it off and leaned back, gazing once more out the window. Yet, a small trace of unease lingered. Roughly 30 minutes passed before Charlotte noticed the captain stepping out of the cockpit. His gaze swept over the cabin, assessing, before settling on her. His eyes narrowed slightly. Approaching her seat, his steps deliberate, he stopped just beside her row. "Good morning again," he greeted, his voice lower but loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "I couldn't help but notice earlier, you seemed unfamiliar with some of our first-class amenities. Would you like me to explain anything?" Charlotte blinked, taken off guard. She set her glass carefully on the tray table, turning fully to face him. "I appreciate the offer, Captain," she said, calm but pointed. "I'm quite comfortable." His smile tightened, never reaching his eyes. "Of course. I just want to ensure all our passengers understand the etiquette and expectations in this cabin. It's important to maintain a certain standard, wouldn't you agree?" The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Charlotte felt the weight of curious glances turning toward her. She could sense it, some silent judgment, perhaps even subtle approval from those who quietly shared the captain's assumptions. Inhaling slowly, she steadied herself. "I'm well aware of the standards, Captain," Charlotte replied, her tone as steady as steel. "I've traveled extensively and understand how things work." The captain's smile faded just slightly. He hesitated, clearly thrown by her poise. "Good to hear," he said at last, though his tone suggested otherwise. "If you need anything else, just ask." With that, he straightened and continued down the aisle, leaving a faint ripple of tension behind him. Charlotte's hands gripped the armrests for a moment before releasing them. She'd met men like him before, ones who wielded authority not as a tool to lead, but as a means to control. Charlotte sat still, her fingers loosely resting on the armrest as she caught the glance from the man across the aisle. His smirk barely concealed his amusement, but she didn't flinch. Moments later, she caught the low murmur from behind. "She must have upgraded. Doesn't look like first class to me." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, forcing the irritation to slide away. It wasn't worth it. Not here, not now. The plane continued on its path, engines humming steadily beneath them. The cabin settled into a calm rhythm, punctuated by the faint clink of glasses and soft chatter. Charlotte opened her book again, though the words blurred as her mind drifted back to the exchange. The captain's tone, his patronizing smile, the whispers, they all carried the same undercurrent. A challenge. A quiet but deliberate test of her patience and resolve. She had spent years in places where respect wasn't handed out, it was earned, forged through action and precision. In the Air Force, her skill defined her. There was no room for doubt, no space for assumptions. But in the civilian world, Prejudice lingered like an unseen storm cloud, just waiting for the right moment to break. Charlotte leaned back in her seat, gazing at the clouds beyond the window. They stretched endlessly in every direction, thick and soft like a blanket draped over the earth. For the first time in a long while, she felt it, that quiet exhaustion. Not from the captain, not from the passengers, but from the weight of always having to rise above. Still, she knew better than to let it show. Her calmness, her unwavering poise, these were the armor she wore without question. As the plane cruised, Charlotte made a silent promise. She wouldn't let anyone define her. Not Captain Morgan, not the man across the aisle, not the hushed voices behind her. The faintest trace of a smile touched her lips. The captain might feel like the master of this aircraft, but he had no idea who he was addressing. The plane glided smoothly through the sky, and for the first time since takeoff, Charlotte felt herself begin to relax. She sipped her water, savoring the coolness against her throat, and allowed herself to sink into the comforting rhythm of the flight. A subtle jolt nudged the cabin. Charlotte's eyes flicked to the window. It was slight, barely enough to rattle the glasses, but she felt it. Years of flying had sharpened her instincts to catch the things others missed. She carefully set her water down and scanned the horizon. The clouds that once seemed gentle had darkened. Their edges were no longer soft but sharp and uneven. The pressure shift was subtle but unmistakable. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We should be through it shortly." Charlotte's grip on the armrest tightened just slightly. Around her, passengers shifted, fastening belts without much urgency. A few exchanged nervous glances but quickly resumed their conversations or movies. Charlotte's eyes, however, stayed fixed on the window. She wasn't afraid, far from it, but she knew better than to dismiss the signs. The plane jolted again. This time, the shudder was stronger. A few gasps floated from nearby rows as the overhead compartments rattled. The seatbelt sign flickered on with a sharp ding. Charlotte adjusted her posture, her body instinctively leaning forward. Her senses tuned in, as if she were back in the cockpit of her old fighter jet, scanning for the source of trouble. The turbulence worsened, growing more erratic with each passing minute. Charlotte could feel the slight shifts in the plane's pitch, the uneven way it dipped and rose as if fighting against invisible hands. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Wind shear, a brewing storm, perhaps even mechanical issues. She'd faced it all before, but this time she was grounded, just another passenger in a seat. Flight attendants hurried through the aisles, checking seatbelts and reassuring passengers. Across the aisle, the man in the suit gripped his armrest so tightly his knuckles paled. Charlotte couldn't help but note the irony. Confidence, it seemed, had its limits. The intercom crackled once more. "We're experiencing a bit more turbulence than expected," Captain Morgan's voice announced, calm but with a barely concealed edge. "We are rerouting to avoid the worst of it. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Charlotte's brow furrowed. Rerouting? That wasn't a decision made lightly. It meant the turbulence wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous. Lightning flickered faintly on the horizon, casting quicksilver streaks across the sky. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. She knew exactly what that meant. Cumulonimbus clouds. A pilot's worst enemy. These towering storm cells brewed chaos, their violent updrafts and downdrafts capable of destabilizing even the most advanced aircraft. The plane lurched hard. A drink cart clattered against its restraints, and with a loud pop, one of the overhead compartments sprang open, sending a pillow tumbling into the aisle. The passenger's calm evaporated in an instant, replaced by startled gasps. Charlotte pulled her seatbelt tighter and straightened. Her mind worked fast, cataloging every shift in pressure, every slight adjustment the aircraft made. The intercom buzzed, but this time, the voice wasn't the captain's. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering severe weather ahead. Please remain seated and calm. We have the situation under control." Charlotte's jaw tightened. The co-pilot's words weren't for her. They were for the passengers. But Charlotte had flown long enough to hear the strain beneath the surface, the delicate dance between reassurance and concealed urgency. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests, her body instinctively aligning with the plane's subtle movements. She wasn't afraid, but frustration simmered beneath her calm. She had flown through conditions far worse than this, yet now she sat helplessly as turbulence rattled the plane. And then she heard it. A faint, uneven whine in the engines. Charlotte's breath caught. That sound wasn't turbulence. It was something deeper, an issue no updraft could explain. It was the groan of machinery under stress, the hum of systems pushed too far. Her instincts screamed for her to move, to act, but she stayed rooted, forcing herself to wait. She was just a passenger. A retired pilot. No authority here. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time. Loose items tumbled from seats, and a few scattered shrieks pierced the cabin. Somewhere in economy, a child's cries rang out, sharp as a knife against the growing tension. Charlotte's eyes drifted toward the cockpit door. If this continues, they'll need help. Another hard jolt rattled the aircraft, sending a flight attendant stumbling. Charlotte watched as the young woman caught herself against a seat, gripping it tightly with pale knuckles. That was enough. Unbuckling her belt, Charlotte rose carefully, steadying herself against the rocking plane. Around her, passengers stared, their faces a blend of confusion and fear. "Ma'am, please sit down." A voice, sharp and strained, cut through the cabin. Charlotte turned, meeting the attendant's wide eyes with a calm gaze. "I need to speak to the captain," Charlotte said, her tone steady but firm. The attendant hesitated. "Ma'am, it's dangerous to—" "I understand the risk," Charlotte interrupted gently. "But I have over 20 years of flight experience. I know what's happening up there. They might need help." The attendant's lips parted, but no words came. Charlotte stepped forward carefully, one hand brushing the backs of seats as the plane trembled beneath her feet. Another jolt rocked the aircraft, and the attendant stumbled. Charlotte's hand shot out, steadying her. "Please," Charlotte said softly, locking eyes with the young woman. "I just need to speak to him." The attendant hesitated, torn between protocol and the quiet authority in Charlotte's voice. With a reluctant nod, the attendant pressed a button near the cockpit door, her fingers trembling slightly. The intercom crackled to life. "Captain, there's a passenger here insisting to speak with you. She says she's a retired pilot." The intercom crackled with static. "Captain Morgan, there's a passenger here insisting to speak with you. She says she's a retired pilot." A long pause followed, the silence stretching over the hum of the engines. Charlotte could imagine the scene inside the cockpit. Morgan's pride likely bristling at the thought of letting a civilian into his domain. The intercom finally crackled back to life, his voice clipped. "We're handling it. Tell her to return to her seat." Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she wasn't surprised. She leaned closer to the intercom, her voice calm but firm. "Captain, this isn't about authority. It's about ensuring the safety of this plane. I've logged over 20 years of flight experience, combat and commercial. I've handled emergencies like this before. If you need assistance, I'm here." Another pause. The uneven whine of the engines cut through the silence again, more pronounced this time. Charlotte knew that sound too well. The cockpit door hissed open. Captain Morgan stood in the doorway, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. His uniform was pristine, but a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. Behind him, the co-pilot's gaze flicked nervously toward Charlotte. His face was pale, the tension visible in the set of his jaw. Morgan stepped aside begrudgingly. "Come in." Charlotte entered, the compact space instantly familiar. The soft glow of instrument panels, the rhythmic pulse of data, and the sharp beeping of an alert filled the air. Her eyes scanned the displays automatically, years of instinct kicking in. The co-pilot broke the silence. "We've got severe crosswinds and one of the engines is running hot. We're rerouting, but—" he hesitated. "We've lost primary communication with air traffic control." Charlotte nodded. "Secondary, intermittent," he replied. "We're trying to re-establish contact." Charlotte stepped closer to the instrument panel, eyes narrowing at the flickering displays. Her hand hovered just above the controls, not touching but studying. "Have you checked the airflow sensors?" she asked, glancing at Morgan. "In weather like this, they can misread the data." Morgan stiffened. "We've checked. This isn't our first flight." Her gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "I never said it was, but this isn't my first emergency either." The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between them. Charlotte could feel the weight of Morgan's hesitation, his reluctance to relinquish control. The plane jolted violently, its nose dipping sharply. Charlotte braced herself against the co-pilot's chair, her stance solid. "We need to balance the thrust manually," she said, her voice even but urgent. "The autopilot can't handle these conditions. It's overcorrecting and putting too much strain on the engines." Morgan's knuckles whitened against the controls, doubt flickering across his face. "Trust me," Charlotte added softly. "I'm not here to take over. I'm here to help." The co-pilot spoke quietly, almost pleading. "Captain, she might be right. The adjustments are too erratic. We've already lost 2% thrust efficiency." Morgan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. Without a word, he disengaged the autopilot. The shift was immediate. The plane responded to Morgan's manual input, the jerky turbulence giving way to smoother, more controlled movement. Charlotte leaned over, studying the engine indicators. "Ease off on engine 2, she said, pointing. "Redistribute to 3 and 4. They're running cooler." Morgan adjusted the controls, following her instructions with deliberate precision. The plane steadied further, though the storm still loomed ahead. Charlotte traced a path on the radar screen with her fingertip. "We need to drop altitude slightly. Stronger wind currents are higher up, but below this cloud line, you'll have more control." Morgan's jaw tightened, but he nodded, gradually bringing the plane down a few hundred feet. The cockpit's atmosphere shifted. The tension hadn't disappeared, but the panic had lessened. For now, they had control. But Charlotte knew this wasn't over. As they continued to descend, the turbulent jolts softened, becoming manageable vibrations. Morgan's hands steadied on the throttle. The plane glided smoothly, dipping beneath the heaviest parts of the storm. Charlotte stepped back slightly, allowing Morgan and the co-pilot to reclaim the cockpit space. She crossed her arms, eyes flicking between the displays. "Good call," the co-pilot murmured, giving Charlotte a small grateful nod. Morgan remained silent, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Charlotte studied him for a long moment. His pride was still intact, but so was his understanding of the reality they faced. As the plane cruised toward calmer skies, Charlotte allowed herself to relax, if only slightly. The hardest part wasn't always flying the plane. Sometimes it was knowing when to let someone else take the controls. Descended toward the narrow strip of asphalt. Charlotte kept her eyes locked on the runway ahead, monitoring Captain Morgan's every move. The co-pilot remained tense but focused, calling out altitude markers as they dropped lower. 1,500 feet, the co-pilot announced. "Keep the descent gradual," Charlotte advised, her voice low but firm. "No sudden corrections, let the plane ride the wind." Morgan didn't respond, but his grip on the throttle shifted subtly, acknowledging her words without conceding. Charlotte noted the way his hands trembled just slightly, nerves masked by routine. The plane trembled again as another gust rocked them from the side. Morgan gritted his teeth, adjusting the ailerons delicately. "Good," Charlotte murmured. "Keep it there." Below, the runway came into full view, narrow, flanked by open fields and dark tree lines in the distance. No lights except for the faint blinking at the edges of the tarmac. Charlotte could tell it wasn't their usual landing site. "Wind shears coming from the left," she said, her eyes narrowing at the instruments. "Compensate with slight right rudder, too much and you'll overcorrect." Morgan exhaled sharply, but followed the instruction. The plane dipped, the tires kissing the ground roughly but evenly. A collective breath filled the cabin as the wheels met the runway with a shuddering screech, the brakes engaging immediately. The plane slowed, rolling steadily down the stretch of pavement. Charlotte allowed herself to relax, leaning back in the jump seat with a faint exhale. Morgan's shoulders dropped slightly, his grip loosening on the controls. "Solid landing," she said simply. He didn't look at her. "I had it under control." Charlotte smiled faintly. "I know." But they both knew the truth lay somewhere in between. As the wheels made firm contact with the runway, Charlotte's quiet, steady guided the descent like an anchor. The plane shuddered, but held its course. Morgan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the throttle, fighting against the relentless push of the wind. Finally, the tires screeched softly against the wet pavement, and the aircraft slowed into a steady roll. A ripple of relieved murmurs swept through the cabin, followed by tentative applause from scattered passengers. Charlotte leaned back, feeling the tension seep from her muscles for the first time since entering the cockpit. She glanced at Morgan. His shoulders sagged slightly as he exhaled, still gripping the controls as if afraid to let go. "Good work," she said softly. Morgan didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed ahead, the quiet hum of the engines filling the space between them. "We'll talk about this later," he finally muttered, his voice unreadable. Charlotte nodded, recognizing the unspoken weight in his tone. For now, the plane was on the ground. That was all that mattered. But she knew this wasn't over. Outside, rain streaked the glass, distorting the flashing lights of emergency vehicles waiting nearby. The plane eased to a stop, the engines sighing into stillness. Charlotte remained seated, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her gaze steady. The small cockpit felt heavier than before, filled with the unspoken tension of what had transpired. Morgan sat rigidly in his seat, his eyes forward. Beside him, the co-pilot, a young man with nervous energy practically radiating from him, fidgeted with his headset, his fingers adjusting switches that no longer required attention. "Clearance to disembark has been granted," the co-pilot finally announced, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "Ground crews are in place." Charlotte rose slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. She lingered for a moment, her eyes tracing the instrument panel, the soft flashing indicators echoing the chaos they had narrowly escaped. She turned to Morgan, her face unreadable. "You handled the landing well," she said, her tone devoid of condescension. Morgan's jaw tightened as if the compliment unsettled him. For a moment, it seemed he wouldn't respond. But then his shoulders dropped slightly, and he exhaled. "Thank you," he replied, though the words seemed to cost him. His eyes never met hers. Charlotte studied him for a breath longer, then gave a slight nod. She hadn't been looking for gratitude, but she understood the importance of acknowledging this moment, even if Morgan couldn't fully recognize it yet. The co-pilot stood, stepping aside. His gaze flicked toward Charlotte, a quiet respect lingering behind his eyes. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I'm glad you were here. I think things could have gone differently." Charlotte allowed herself a faint smile, the first since stepping into the cockpit. "You did your part," she said. "That's what matters." Stepping into the main cabin, Charlotte felt the shift in atmosphere. Passengers had begun gathering their belongings, the air still heavy with residual tension and relief. She could feel their eyes on her, whispers rippling as recognition settled in. "That's her," someone murmured. She went into the cockpit. What was she doing up there? Another voice asked, half in awe, half in disbelief. Charlotte ignored the glances and quiet speculation. She retrieved her bag with practiced calm, her movements unaffected by the attention. The man in the navy suit, the same one who had smirked at her before takeoff, cleared his throat as she approached. "Hey," he said awkwardly, his confidence frayed. "Were you helping the pilots?" Charlotte met his gaze briefly, her expression neutral. "Yes," she replied simply. His face reddened, his earlier smugness dissolving into discomfort. "I didn't realize." His voice trailed off as if unsure how to finish the thought. Charlotte didn't wait for him to find the words. She hoisted her bag over her shoulder and walked on, leaving him to wrestle with whatever realization had struck him. As she exited the plane, the cold night air hit her face, crisp and refreshing against the stale tension inside. Emergency vehicles lined the tarmac, their flashing lights reflecting eerily off the slick pavement. A small cluster of airline officials stood nearby, their expressions taut with concern. A woman stepped forward, her name tag reading Evelyn Sharp, Regional Manager. Her eyes flicked to Charlotte, curiosity and urgency mingling in her gaze. "Miss Wren asked," her voice respectful but questioning. Charlotte gave a small nod. "That's me." Evelyn's expression softened, if only slightly. As Charlotte followed Evelyn into the terminal, the bright overhead lights cast sharp shadows across the polished floors. Evelyn's tone softened as they walked. "We've been informed that you assisted the crew during the flight," Evelyn said, her gaze steady but warm. "On behalf of the airline, I want to thank you for stepping in. We'll need a quick debrief, of course, but from what I hear, you made a significant impact." Charlotte's lips curved into a faint, restrained smile. "I did what was necessary," she replied simply. Evelyn nodded, respect evident in her eyes. "If you're willing, we'd appreciate it if you stayed for a brief meeting with the crew. It won't take long." Charlotte offered a small nod, Accountability had never been something she shied away from, and she knew this conversation was inevitable. More than that, it was an opportunity, a chance to set the record straight. Not just for herself, but for every lingering doubt she'd faced during that flight. The meeting room, tucked into a quiet corner of the terminal, was sparse and sterile. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their cold glow casting reflections off the glass conference table. Captain Morgan and the co-pilot, whose name tag read Eric Dawson, were already seated when Charlotte entered. Morgan's expression was guarded, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Eric, on the other hand, sat upright, visibly nervous as he adjusted his watch. Evelyn took her place at the head of the table, tablet in hand. Her professionalism left no room for unnecessary pleasantries. "Let's get straight to it," Evelyn began, glancing toward Morgan. "Captain Morgan, I'd like to hear your assessment of the situation." Morgan cleared his throat, his fingers flexing slightly before settling once more. "The turbulence was worse than forecasted," he said carefully, his words measured. "Crosswinds were heavy, and one of the engines ran hot under the strain. Ms. Reynolds offered assistance during a critical moment." Charlotte caught the subtle hesitation in his voice, the way he carefully chose his words. She didn't interrupt. Morgan shifted slightly. Her input was valuable. The words felt like they cost him. His gaze remained fixed on the table. Her experience was evident. Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "Miss Reynolds, is there anything you'd like to add?" Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but direct. "I stepped in because the situation was escalating, and I recognized the signs. I respect Captain Morgan's authority, but my priority was the safety of everyone on board. I've flown through storms like that before." Evelyn studied her for a long moment, then shifted her gaze back to Morgan. "Captain, do you believe her involvement was warranted?" The room stilled. The soft hum of airport activity filtered faintly through the walls, but inside the conference room, tension sat heavy in the air. Morgan's jaw tightened. For a brief moment, Charlotte thought he might deflect, but then with a sharp exhale, he relented. "Yes," he admitted, his tone reluctant but honest. She was right. The quiet weight of his words hung between them, a subtle acknowledgement of the expertise that had nearly gone ignored. Evelyn's expression softened as she turned back to Charlotte. "Thank you, Miss Reynolds," she said, her tone warmer. "Your actions were exemplary. We'll ensure this is documented appropriately." Charlotte inclined her head, her composure unwavering. She hadn't come for validation, but she appreciated the chance to clarify the record. As the meeting concluded, she rose, the strain of the evening beginning to lift from her shoulders. Stepping out into the terminal, Charlotte paused near the glass windows. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the tarmac glistening beneath the glow of the airport lights. She'd faced storms before, in the air and in life. This one had been no different. And like always, she'd walked away stronger. Captain Richard Morgan stood by the far end of the terminal, his gaze fixed on the dark stretch of runway outside. The distant hum of ground crews filled the space around him, but he seemed caught in thought. The meeting had ended nearly an hour ago, but the weight of it lingered heavily on his shoulders. Charlotte's calm, steady presence across the table played over in his mind, her confidence a stark contrast to the frustration he'd barely concealed. Doubt gnawed at him, something he hadn't felt in years. Morgan prided himself on control, on commanding any situation. But tonight that control had slipped, exposing cracks he hadn't anticipated. Footsteps echoed softly behind him. He turned slightly, spotting Charlotte approaching with her usual unhurried stride, her travel bag slung over one shoulder. For a moment he hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Captain Morgan," Charlotte said, her tone level but free of hostility, "I didn't mean to undermine you." The directness caught him off guard. He cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "You didn't," he admitted slowly, though the words felt uneasy. "You stepped in when it was necessary." She nodded once. Good, because this was never about authority, it was about the safety of that flight. Morgan glanced at her, then back out the window. The rain had left faint streaks on the glass. "I know," he said quietly. "That doesn't make it easier." Charlotte studied him for a long moment. She could see it. The tension in his shoulders, the faint tremor in his hands, the aftermath of adrenaline, the lingering weight of realizing how close things had come to unraveling. It wasn't weakness, she'd seen it before. You did what you needed to, she said. That's what matters. Morgan's gaze didn't shift. Doesn't feel that way. It will, Charlotte replied, slinging her bag higher on her shoulder. Eventually. He didn't stop her as she walked away, but her words stayed with him long after she disappeared into the crowd. Should never have been shut. Morgan's gaze remained fixed on the tarmac, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. Charlotte's words echoed louder than the low hum of the terminal around him. You did well on the landing, she had said, her tone sincere and free of any pretense. It wasn't a platitude, it was genuine. He had been surprised by the compliment. You mean that? Charlotte's eyes hadn't wavered. I don't say things I don't mean. You kept your composure when it counted. That's what matters. The simplicity of her words disarmed him more than he expected. A knot he hadn't realized was there loosened slightly in his chest. Morgan nodded to himself, the weight of the evening settling differently now. The frustration he'd felt, the one directed at Charlotte stepping into his cockpit, had shifted. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to recognition. You're retired military, he had asked her after the meeting, his voice quieter, more curious than commanding. Air Force, Charlotte confirmed, her posture still relaxed but poised. 20 years, fighter jets mostly, but I logged plenty of hours in transport aircraft too. Morgan let out a low whistle. Fighter jets? That's impressive. Charlotte gave a small smile. It taught me a lot, precision, staying calm under pressure, and how to work with people who don't always see eye to eye with you. The weight of that last sentence hadn't been pointed, but Morgan felt it land nonetheless. He shifted slightly, his fingers brushing against the captain's stripes on his sleeve. I'll admit, Morgan said, his tone hesitant, I didn't give you the benefit of the doubt when you stepped into the cockpit. I assumed the worst. Charlotte hadn't responded immediately. She let the silence linger, as if giving him the space to find his own conclusion. I was wrong, Morgan said finally, the admission tasting unfamiliar but not bitter. You knew what you were doing. More than that, you had the courage to step up when it mattered. Not everyone can do that. Charlotte's expression softened, but there was no trace of smugness. Assumptions can be dangerous, Captain. In the air, they can get people killed, and down here, she gestured subtly to the bustling terminal, they close doors that shouldn't be shut. Morgan exhaled slowly. You're right, I've got some things to think about. Charlotte tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady but without judgment. We all do. The important part is learning from it. Morgan chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. You sound like one of my old instructors. Maybe I am, Charlotte said with a rare smile. In a way. The initial awkwardness between them had softened after that. Morgan found himself asking about her experiences, curious about the life she had lived behind that composed exterior. Charlotte shared a few stories, nothing too heavy, just enough to paint a picture of the challenges she'd faced. By the time they parted, something had shifted. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was the foundation of something close. Mutual respect, an understanding of the weight they both carried as pilots. Morgan watched as Charlotte disappeared into the terminal crowd, her calm, measured walk no different from how she had entered the cockpit earlier that night. As the rain on the tarmac faded under the bright lights, Morgan stood at the glass, his thoughts tangled in reflection. He couldn't change the turbulence they had faced that night, but he could change what came next. With that thought, he turned away from the window, his steps heavy but determined. Charlotte had stepped forward when it mattered most. Now it was his turn. Morgan's reflection in the glass seemed to stare back at him, a reminder of the pride that had nearly clouded his judgment. It wasn't just the turbulence that left him uneasy. It was the realization that his insistence on control had risked more than he wanted to admit. He had always believed himself to be a steady leader, calm under pressure, unshakable. But tonight, cracks had surfaced, ones he couldn't ignore. Captain? The voice startled him slightly. He turned to see Laura, one of the flight attendants, standing a few feet away. She shifted her weight, her hands clasped in front of her. Yes, Laura? Morgan's voice was softer than usual. She hesitated, stepping closer. I just wanted to check in. Are you all right after everything? Morgan blinked. The question caught him off guard. His crew rarely asked about his well-being. It was always the other way around. He was the one meant to offer reassurance. "I'm fine," he said after a moment, though the words felt hollow. "It's been a long night, but we made it through." Laura nodded, but her gaze lingered on him with quiet concern. "Miss Reynolds, she was incredible," Laura added, her voice carrying quiet admiration. "I've never seen anyone step up like that. It was humbling." Morgan felt something stir, pride, perhaps, or lingering shame. "Yes," he agreed softly, "she was." Laura gave him a small, understanding smile. "If you need anything, Captain, we're all here for you." He nodded, offering a faint smile in return. "Thank you, Laura." As she walked away, Morgan's gaze instinctively drifted toward the terminal. Charlotte Reynolds had disappeared into the crowd, but something made him want to seek her out. Not to apologize, but to acknowledge the weight of the moment. Charlotte sat quietly near the terminal window, watching as the rain glistened on the tarmac under the soft airport lights. Her hands rested on the armrests, her back straight, but her mind wandered. She thought of past flights, old decisions, and the moments that had shaped her. Tonight wasn't the first time she'd had to step forward when it mattered, but something about it felt different. The approaching footsteps barely registered until she glanced sideways. Morgan stood nearby, his posture less rigid than before. His expression, though hesitant, carried a weight that hadn't been there earlier. Charlotte gestured to the seat across from her, and he hesitated only briefly before lowering himself into it. For a few moments, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but rather filled with everything that hadn't yet been said. Morgan was the first to break it. "I wanted to say something," he began, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "Tonight made me realize how much I still have to learn." Charlotte tilted her head slightly. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes held curiosity. "Learning is a lifelong process, Captain," she replied. "No one gets it right every time." He dropped his gaze to his hands, his fingers running along the stitching of his uniform. "I always thought of myself as a good leader," Morgan admitted, the words coming slower now. "But tonight, I saw my limits. And I saw what leadership really looks like." Charlotte arched an eyebrow slightly, but let him continue without interruption. "You didn't just take control in the cockpit," Morgan added, glancing at her. "You brought clarity, confidence. You didn't hesitate, and because of that, we got through it." Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but firm. "Leadership isn't about having all the answers, Captain. It's about knowing when to trust the people around you. That's not weakness, it's strength." Morgan's eyes met hers, searching for any trace of judgment, but there was none, only quiet understanding. "You're right," he said at last, his voice sincere, "and I hope I can learn from that." Charlotte studied him for a moment, sensing the truth behind his words. "You will," she replied simply, "as long as you're willing to listen." Morgan exhaled, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I think tonight made me realize I need to." The initial tension between them had eased, giving way to something calmer, more reflective. They spoke quietly after that, about the flight, their experiences, and the shared weight that came with flying. For the first time, Morgan didn't see Charlotte as a passenger, or even just a fellow pilot. He saw her as a peer, someone who understood the responsibility that came with the job as deeply as he did. When they finally rose to part ways, the rain had stopped, leaving the tarmac shimmering under the airport lights. Morgan extended his hand, his grip firm but respectful. "Thank you, Miss Reynolds, not just for tonight, but for the lesson." Charlotte shook his hand, her expression softening. "Take it to heart, Captain, and remember, every flight is a chance to do better." Morgan nodded, her words settling over him like a quiet vow. As she walked away, disappearing into the glow of the terminal, Morgan remained by the window. Tonight hadn't just been about the storm outside. It had been about the one within himself. He knew he couldn't change the turbulence they faced that evening, but he could control the pilot. He would be moving forward. And as he turned away from the glass, his steps heavier but more certain, he silently promised himself he would do better. Charlotte Reynolds' strength and calm under pressure served as a powerful reminder that true leadership is rooted in trust, courage, and the willingness to step up when it matters most. Her story stands as a testament to resilience, the quiet but unwavering kind that leaves an impact far beyond the moment. It shows us that one person's decision to rise can change the course for everyone around them. If Charlotte's journey inspired you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable tales of bravery and perseverance. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Bookmark back.